We can now think about applying our model to some of the data that we looked at the beginning of the chapter, right? Remember, we said that in 1900, people had lower income and so therefore a lower wage, but tended to work more each day. Whereas in 2013, we work less each day, we have more free time per day, and we have a higher wage. And so one way that we could think about that is that, if we were here at point A in 1900 with a low wage, right, we have a flat budget constraint, and we're here in 2013, we have a higher wage, a steeper budget constraint, then the income effect is this effect. Remember, what we do here is we draw the indifference curve where we end up, and then draw a budget constraint that is parallel to our original budget constraint. The income effect says, hey, we should be working a whole lot less. But the substitution effect says, all right, well, because we have a higher wage, we're going to actually work more than we would with just the income effect. And so the balance between those two is the overall effect where we move from point A to point D. Now, we should have a couple caveats here, right? These are average numbers across the country, and so we're taking an individual choice model and we're applying it to everybody in the economy, which may not be the best thing to do. And actually, if you look at the data, it's interesting because for an individual, as their wage goes up, they often work more. And so higher wage people tend to have less free time per day, which we would say the substitution effect is dominating. But over time, we perhaps as a society say, hey, maybe we should work less. Maybe we value that free time. Although remember where that extra free time has come from. That's come from unions demanding a shorter hours. It's come from legislation in places like France that say you have to take a certain number of weeks of vacation every year. And so sometimes individual preferences and social preferences may not be exactly the same thing, and we should think about the differences between the two. If we think about, cross-country differences, then perhaps some preferences can explain those differences, right? And so, Mexico's down here, Turkey's down here, South Korea, the US, Netherlands, any places where those indifference curves cross, like South Korea and the US, say, we must have different preferences. One thing about individual indifference curves is that they should never cross because then there's points where, one indifference curve is better than the other one, but then another point where it's switched, and that should never be the case of indifference curves. And so indifference curves, at least in rational individuals, and we're not, of course, always rational, should never cross, like at point Q. So are those preferences of each individual in each country? Maybe. Maybe they're social preferences, right? Maybe we as a country decide, hey, we like to work. Work is what we do in the United States. Whereas France says, hey, we want to enjoy life. We will work some, but we don't want to work all the time. It could be differences in culture, right? Just sort of what you grow up, what is normal. And it could be differences in politics and institutions, right? Sort of legal limits on hours worked. Um, and all of those things could be, influencing each other. And so it doesn't have to be one or the other. It really could be all three, and it could be how those three interact with individual preferences. So is this a good model? Well, it's not realistic in the sense that every individual figures out, the shape of their indifference curves and matches it to their budget constraint, right? People and even firms don't do these marginal rate of substitution and marginal rate of transformation calculations. Another problem with the model is that most people don't choose their working hours, right? So if you have an hourly job, you're often told, okay, you work, from 9 to 5, you get half an hour from lunch, you work Monday to Friday, you have 2 weeks of vacation every year. Or you might say, all right, I can give you 2 shifts, so you're going to work 16 hours this week, whether or not you want more. A lot of low wage workers don't have much control at all about how much or when they work. And so for them, this is not much of a good model. On the other hand, it might be an okay approximation, right? People will try out working more, try out working less. They'll get raises, they'll see what suits them best, and they'll make decisions about what makes them happiest. And so in that case, they may come to a point where we're at least close to the point where the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the marginal rate of transformation. But it's an approximation, right? It helps us understand this real world phenomenon, thinking about income and substitution effects, thinking about preferences, thinking about changes in wages, both for an individual over their lifetime, but also for a society, for a country as a whole over time. One problem with this model is that we can't really say it's not true, right? So a model tends to be more useful when you can falsify it, when you can collect data that says this model is not true. And if you keep collecting data and none of it says that the model isn't true, then that's a pretty good model. But for this model, we keep collecting data and it's just, okay, well, the income effect dominates or the substitution effect dominates, right? No matter what data you collect, it all fits into the model. And so in that case, it may not be a very good model. So just in terms of the summary, right, this is one of the really most important foundational chapters of microeconomics. And this decision making, the way the book frames it, is all about these tangent places between two curves, two sets of curves, right? In our case, it's between the feasible frontier, which is based on the production function, and indifference curves, which are based on preferences. And that point where they're just tangent, where they just touch, is where the marginal rate of substitution, which comes from indifference curves, is equal to the marginal rate of transformation, which comes from the production function. And we can think about this model in terms of, labor choices, right? In terms of how much people are going to work when the wage changes as a combination of the income effect, which tells people to work less, and the substitution effect, which tells people to work more. But we do want to think about this as a very simple model, and it may not be the best model in terms of explaining labor market choices.